Welcome to Life, bringing you insight and experiences into love, relationships, and fertility with a focus on enjoying life and moving forward. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with Hayley King regarding all things donor conception. Hi, and welcome to Life, Love, Insight, Fertility Experiences. Today, I am so thrilled to have Hayley King. Did I say your middle name right? The middle one right? I hope, Hayley. She is, I have to say, probably one of my favorite people professionally to work with. And even personally, I just have gotten to know her over the last 18 months. As soon as she went live on Instagram, I had to contact her. And I have to say, professionally, I just adore her. I really do. So, Hayley, I'm so glad that you're here today. You had such an incredible story that when I reached out to you at first, I'm like, oh, this woman is unbelievable. So, could we just start off? I didn't give you an intro telling people who you are, but maybe would you like to tell everybody a little bit about who you are and why you came onto Instagram? And my God, what you're doing now is fabulous.
Well, thank you for having me on, Laurie. Like I say, it's a privilege to speak to you on your show here. So I'm Hayley. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm from the UK. So, and going back to my name, it always seems to stump people because it is a little bit more difficult to say, and I've double-barreled it just to make it more confusing. So I connected with Laurie about 18 months ago now, and mainly because I'd set up an Instagram account following an interview I did about my story. So my story starts, I suppose, in the early 80s, where my parents were suffering with infertility. So they were actually one of the first couples to go through early trials for IVF in the late 70s and early 80s. At the first ever IVF clinic in the UK. And it was actually one of the first ever IVF clinics in the world. And they were successful, and I came along, and I was fondly known as a test tube baby growing up, which is what I was called. But sadly, what I didn't know until a lot later in life was that as part of that pioneering treatment, an anonymous sperm donor was used.
Did you know you were a test tube baby? Hayley, did you know you were a test tube?
Yes, I did. Yeah. So I grew up. Yeah. So I found out about age 12, my parents sat me down and told me, because back then, Laurie, obviously, as you probably know, IVF was such a new technology. When I was born, I was in all the newspapers, in all like the local papers in the UK, and my parents had obviously kept those, and they brought all the newspaper articles out to show me when I was about 12. And I remember it being quite a very vivid event in my childhood, that being told, but they didn't. Yeah, they didn't tell me about the anonymous donor part, mostly because the donor was anonymous, and they were told not to tell by the doctors, because that was common. Mm-hmm. And then, like I say, I found out a lot later in life. Then fast forward 20 years, and I'm in my early 30s, and sadly I found out, like I say, a late disclosure that I was donor conceived, and that obviously part of that treatment that my parents had, anonymous donor, was used. And it was a huge shock to find out so late. And I always sort of say that in that moment, nothing changed, but everything changed.
The whole world had to be shaken in that moment.
Yeah, and it was very much like my dad was still my dad, obviously, but I think you grow up in life having certain sort of family narratives, and where you get your blonde hair from, or your blue eyes, or your like for a certain sport or food, and you kind of attribute those things to certain family members, don't you, with family storytelling. And all of a sudden, I suppose in that moment, I kind of had a realization that actually, some of those stories were wrong. And I did have a very big shift in what I would sort of say is about my identity. Sure. And I did wonder who this donor was. Like I say, so the reason why I'm actually on Instagram, though, is because a few years after I found out about being donor conceived, I actually had donor conceived children with my wife. So I'm in a gay relationship. So we used a sperm donor to have our children. So I suppose I'm in that slightly unusual position, in that I'm donor conceived and a recipient parent to donor conceived children. So that's where I suppose my Instagram, or my public story, started, if you like. And that's where we met.
That's where we met. Yeah. Well, I kind of had the chills as you're telling me the story. I didn't realize that you were one of the first test tube babies in UK, and it was in the paper. I never knew that. That's quite a story. And I'm thinking to myself, 12 years old and finding out that, and then later in life finding out that you were conceived through donor, that does shake your world a little bit, or more than a little bit. It absolutely shakes your world because you grow up thinking one thing. But the beauty of having your own children through donor conception and then being able to give them the support and the care and the confidence to grow up in that, is just, I always thought, such a beautiful story because you're really able to help them understand firsthand what it is to be donor conceived and to understand that the parent is the person who raises you. That's your parent. There's no question about that. And people are beginning to realize it because now the philosophy has changed so much, right, Hayley? You tell the child as early and as often as you can. It just becomes part of a normal conversation as opposed to this big secret.
Exactly, 100%, Laurie. And it was that was my motivation to start speaking about my story, really, because I think it was only when our children were born and they were about 2.5, starting to speak. Mm-hmm. And my wife and I really started having serious conversations about, right, what are we going to do differently? I don't like to sort of look back too much about the things maybe my parents didn't do because they're wonderful parents. They did the best with the information that they had at the time. And sadly, many decades ago, or, not even that long ago, really, even into the sort of the 90s and the 2000s, parents were still encouraged not to tell their children about being donor conceived. Whereas now, thankfully, there is a shift towards open.
And you're one of the people who's helped to make that shift. You see, I think what's happened is as the donor conceived population has become older, they found their voice and they said, we need to know this. You can't keep this from us. And on another hand, I work with so many of the intended parents, and it's a heaviness that they carry, and it's the grief that they have to go through. And then it's the process they need to go through to become comfortable in telling their child. So I also think that this new philosophy, which is, I'd say about between 10 and 15 years old, depending on the doctor you go to. And even in some religious communities today, they tell the parents not to tell if you're in a close-knit community. But I think it has absolutely come from people like you who have said, listen, let's put this out in the open and I am this person and we need to know. And there's nothing wrong with knowing.
Yeah, and I hope so. And I think some of it, I totally relate to the fear side of things with parents, because obviously I've been a parent too. And I'm also the non-genetic parent to my kids. And, we used my wife's eggs and she carried. So I do understand the insecurities. And I think then if you've got extra overlays of infertility, long struggles to become parents, all of a sudden the focus, shifts from, I think the main focus is getting pregnant and having the baby. And a lot of parents, I think, maybe aren't counseled enough in relation to what to expect with donor conception. And I think sometimes donor conception can even be seen as like a fertility add-on, which is crazy, really. So I think there's lots of things that I can understand why once the child's here, all of a sudden there's this fear I don't know whether to tell. How do I tell? Because parents haven't had necessarily the support leading up to this stage. And like I say, that's what I'd like to sort of try and, I like to think that I'm sort of helping to change.
My mind's going in so many directions of the things that you have done as you're saying these things, right? I remember once there was a post on your Instagram, which you may not even remember. And it was right when I started contacting you about the medical record initiative to have them start to ask people, whether or not they were donor conceived or conceived through third-party reproduction when they're born. And I reached out to you for your support in that. And of course, you were incredibly supportive with it, which I appreciate. But somebody wrote on your Instagram page, you're setting a great example for your children and they should follow in your footsteps. And your response was what I loved, which is, well, I'm doing this so my children don't have to follow in my footsteps.
Yeah. And that's what I'd like to think. And that is a huge motivating factor for me, is to make it a better place for our children, not just being raised within an LGBTQ family, because there's those challenges too, but to actually, when we're talking in, the very niche area of donor conception, is hopefully making things better for them, so that the world is more educated about donor conception. So it's not unusual that a child, goes to the doctor, like with your campaign, Laurie, and says, when they're filling in medical forms or forms for whatever it is, and there isn't a box for donor conceived or adopted or whatever it may be. And they're not made to feel othered, because the knock-on effects of that can be long-lasting for people. And I think, like, hopefully, like you say, there's lots of things that we could do a whole series of on talking about the things that could be improved within the industry or whatever. But I think these little steps that are being made, like the initiative that you're doing, Laurie, with others, to get donor conceived and adopted on.
The other thing, I appreciate that. Yeah. And it's happening. It's happening globally. Yeah. It's going to take about a year or two, but it is happening, just to let people know, if they're listening, that this will be included in the global initiative. And hopefully within the next couple of years, people will know that their doctors will start to ask the question, open up the conversation. I didn't understand one thing you said. So maybe you could clarify it, but I also don't want to forget to tell people that you have this incredible tip sheet that you offer that really helps people in understanding. You call it the Nugget series. And
that's it.
Really, I mean, I keep saying I love it, but I do, because it really breaks things down so simply in how to talk to your children. And, your website will be up soon, and I'm sure that will also have a wealth of knowledge. But you said while you were talking that it's considered an add-on, and I'm just wondering what you meant by that.
Yeah, so just in terms of fertility treatment, I think with infertility, so normally parents will try with their own, eggs or sperm first, won't they? Whatever the combination is. And if they're not able to, I think sometimes donor conception is brought in by doctors, is what they call it an add-on here in the UK. So that might be, it's just like a fertility treatment. So it could be a trial in a new drug, or doing a different procedure, or doing ITSI, or whatever it may be. And donor conception, a lot of the time, is kind of brought in as an add-on. So, right, we haven't been able to make you pregnant with your own eggs for whatever reason. So we're going to try donor eggs. And parents are kind of rushed sometimes to that stage, I think, without being properly counseled about decisions that they make at that stage. So, for example, there's a huge difference between the type of donor that you'll select. So whether it be anonymous or open ID or a known donor. And I think these conversations that potentially will go on to impact your family aren't being had at stage one, if you like. And that's what I mean by it being treated as treated as an add-on.
Yeah, I never heard the expression before add-on, but thank you.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't think we use it in the United States. We might, but I may not know about it, but I don't believe that we do. I find that people look at donor conception, at least in the heterosexual community, right? I always like to break it out now into a heterosexual community versus the LGBTQ community. And in the heterosexual community, they look at it kind of like, the last thing they want to do. And it's the last thing that people assume they're going to do, because most people assume that they're going to have a baby. They're going to decide when they want to have one, and then they're going to get pregnant. With the LGBTQ community, it's a little bit different, because typically if you're in a gay or lesbian relationship, then you're going to use donor in some points. The people who have changed their gender, if they have kept their own egg or sperm, then maybe they will be able to. So it depends on the breakout, but I think each category really needs to sit down and have a conversation, or two or three or four, regarding what it is that their future is going to hold and their family building process is going to bring. And I absolutely agree with you. ASRM, which is the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, and I don't know if they do this in the UK, but I believe they do. They do set guidelines that you are supposed to have a psych educational consult. And it's typically one, I tend to think it should be more, by somebody who's trained in working with people on fertility journeys, and specifically third-party reproduction. And at those sessions, you're really supposed to be able to go through all of the pieces, or almost all the pieces, that you really want to consider prior to having a donor conceived child, like you started to say. And, we should really talk about that a little bit more. But it's so important. I can't urge people enough to recognize that you're not being evaluated psychologically whether or not you should have a child. What you're doing is you're being educated. And because it's a therapist, people get so nervous and stressed before they go. But they usually walk out feeling relieved because you're talking about these things that you haven't been given the opportunity to really talk about, whether it's yourself and you're a single parent or with your partner. So, oh God, I so agree with you that it's so important. So what do we do about it? Like, how do we make sure that people recognize the significance?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the absence of regulation, so in the UK, we do have a regulatory body that deals with donor conception called the HFEA, which is the Human Fertilization Embryology Authority. And we do have a bit similar to what you've just said there, Laurie. We call it implications counselling here. So normally, if you're an individual or a couple having treatment at a HFEA clinic, it doesn't count if you're obviously doing at-home IUI or you go abroad. But if you're having treatment at a UK clinic that's regulated, you are entitled to have access to implications counselling, and that does vary though. So although we have guidelines, they're not massively like you could speak to somebody in the north of England, and it would be very different to someone like locally to me. I live in Wales here in the UK, and the standard of that implications counselling would be very different. Personally, I would like to see that kind of standardized across, the board. But, I'm also mindful that, fertility treatment costs a lot of money. So if parents have to go through these processes, it might cost more money. And who's going to pay for that and all these kinds of things. But I do think it's so important. And I think sometimes it's a bit like hindsight, isn't it? You don't realize how important that counselling is until after you've got children sometimes. Right. And I think like it's a lot of the time it's when you look back, you think, oh, I wish that I talked to my counsellor about worldwide family limits, or I wish I talked to my counsellor about the difference between using an open ID donor or someone that I knew, a friend, and the implications, I suppose, further down the road. But yeah, in terms of, implementing that worldwide, I don't know what the answer is, to be honest, because lots of different nations do it differently across the board, don't they? So it's
well, I suppose don't allow it.
Yeah.
And we have these people who go on Facebook groups because of and they get donors on Facebook groups, and the implication of that is also significant legally. So the education, I think, is so important. You went to a stakeholders meeting, didn't you, recently, and talked about it?
Yeah. I went to, so in the UK, there's lots of discussion at the moment about our rules and regulations to do with donor conception. So we actually, so it's actually illegal to have a fully anonymous donor in the UK, and has been since 2005. But what they're on about introducing is that they're looking at the laws and reforming them, and they're looking at different options. So they've been having stakeholder meetings here in the UK, which I was really lucky to go to one the other day. And one of the issues that was raised was this implications counselling, and could it be improved? What does it involve? And it was just really interesting to actually hear what's happening at ground level, which, like I say, it does vary dramatically across the UK, the level of counselling that's going on.
Yeah. Did you feel like you were heard about therapy?
Yeah. I think quite a key point though was that the stakeholder room was full of lots of different people. So we had people from clinics, people that are responsible for donor screening. We had researchers. We had someone that's an egg donor that was there. We had donor conceived people, recipient parents, all these different legal experts and all the rest of it, all sort of in a room chatting about these subjects. But I actually just turned to the room at one point and sort of said, look, for everyone that's here, that the people that work at clinics, have you actually ever spoken to an adult donor conceived person before to sort of, find out a little bit about what they think? Not one person in the room put the hand up. And that, I think, in itself, just sort of kind of showed, it is not to say that they're not open to discussing these things with donor conceived people, but I think that kind of question left kind of, we call it a tumbleweed. There was just like a tumbleweed when I asked it.
What did you say what did you say to them when there was no response?
I just sort of said, I think that we're maybe at a time now where we should be listening, a bit like what you said at the start of the chat, Laurie. We maybe are at a situation in 2023 that if we are looking to improve, the things for donor conceived, whether that's, donor conceived families, parents, children, improve the quality of life and opportunities for our families, that maybe we should be listening to people that, have lived through it, and maybe we can learn from it. And yeah, I mean, I think quite a few people, I think maybe a few light bulb moments came on for these people.
I hope so. I think I have tears in my eyes right now. I certainly hope so, because
Yeah.
it's so important. I went to a stakeholders meeting. I think I had told you, right?
Yeah.
In where was it? It was in LA right before the ASRM conference, and I was really honored to be there. Because it was the same thing, right? A whole bunch of people that were in the room representing a whole bunch of different parties. This topic was on units. It was on the this donor conceived community, and I was speaking on family unit size.
Yeah. So siblings.
Yeah, how many siblings, and how do you identify them, and how can we control this, and how do we look at it? And in the room were really an array of representation, right? So there were some doctors in the room, some nurses in the room. There were the some of the large donor banks were in the room, right, which was very interesting, right? Donor conceived people, and so it was an array of people, and to listen to their reaction as you talk, or as other people talk about different types of screenings that are done and how they're done. It was fascinating, right? Because some of the clinics absolutely require all donors to get screened, and some don't. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to be really careful here in the US to make sure that when you're going for a donor, you make sure that screening is part of the criteria for the bank that you're using. So, yeah,
I think it's important. They're important meetings, but I think I just hope that some movement occurs after them, because I suppose it's a lot of energy and time for people to invest, isn't it? And hopefully there's movement afterwards. But I think with yourselves over in the US, where you don't really have much in the way of formal regulation compared to other countries around the world, I personally would love to see, like I say, some more regulatory changes brought into yourselves over in the US, especially because you guys are one of the biggest exporters of donor sperm and donor eggs worldwide. So what goes on in the US, because I've sort of been asked before, why are you so interested, I suppose, in the industry when it's happening over the pond in America? And I'm like, well, because it affects the UK, because, for example, a statistic I found out recently, and over 50% of donor sperm that was used in the UK in 2019, newly registered donors, were from overseas.
Oh, my goodness. It's huge.
So it's a huge amount of donor conceived children that are obviously being born to American donors or Danish donors. And whilst, that's great in terms of accessibility, I think we also do need to be looking at things like family limits and things like that, because with the free movement of donor eggs and sperms, like I say, it's great for accessibility. But in the absence of regulation, a certain things like banks and that sort of profiting more than they should, and they're not really looking at, the best interests of the donor conceived families that are being created.
So if we look at that, right, because you were saying in the UK, nobody can be anonymous, but you were a little older when you found out, and then you started to do a search, if you don't mind talking about that.
No, not at all, no.
Yeah, so you started to do a search to see who biologically was connected to you. Yeah. And so if these people are scattered all over the world, that becomes very, very difficult and challenging.
Potentially, yeah. I think it's important to say that some donor conceived people aren't necessarily interested to search for, genetic relatives or genetic kin. But then the ones that are, I suppose, the more there are, and wherever they are in the world, become, and if they're not recorded, then if you've got a donor conceived person that is interested in finding out, say, a sibling or a genetic parent, and the donor, in order to get that information becomes more complicated. I kind of would like to get to a stage, where it is not as complicated and it should be readily available. So if a donor conceived person, wants to find out that information, they don't have to send their, DNA off to, a bit like I had to really, and, multiple sites, and spend hours on genealogy, record searching and things like that. Because it's stressful and it's complicated. And I think, like you say, it shouldn't have to be really.
Yeah. And the emotions that have to follow suit with that, when you're sending it off, and then when maybe you find out a match of a sibling, or a match of a biological parent or the donor, that's all hard, even if you're, and sucks mixed emotions, I would imagine.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it is. And you're trying to navigate, with my own circumstance, finding my, genetic father and, my half siblings through DNA testing. You're trying to navigate relationships that you have no idea what they should look like, I think society likes to put people in boxes, don't they? And I've spoken a bit about this before on my account, but there isn't really a box for someone that was raised at the moment anyway. I find like my relationship that I've got with my genetic father, so my parents' sperm donor, I've got to know Jonathan very well, but people are always very like, oh, so they want to put him in a box, like, and it's hard because I don't see him as a father figure. I don't really see him as, what is a donor relationship meant to look like? It's very hard. And I think these are all things that I'm trying to kind of preempt for our own children now, because potentially they may be things that they have to deal with. And I think the idea is that, hopefully they'll be a better situation for them, and we'll be able to support them through the process as opposed to trying to do it like me and my, I'm 40 now, trying to do it now.
Do you think the boxes are helpful in any way?
Sometimes not. I think not the rigid ones. I think sometimes people like boxes to keep things in order, don't they? And to kind of help understand the situation. But when they're very rigid, it's difficult. And they're not always helpful. No, I don't think so.
Yeah. I know. I think it's so hard, especially since it's so new. It's been going on for so many years, but it's still really new that we're dealing with it. And boxes make it harder. I think boxes make a lot of things harder, but at the same time, they give a little security.
Yeah, and that's what I would say. They have their place, but it is hard. And I'm still learning, even though I'm donor conceived, I have donor conceived children. There's things that I know today that, if I'd have maybe known before having children, my wife and I have discussed it. We may have done things slightly differently because of the information that we have now. And going back to kind of like the implications counselling, really sort of doing full circle with the talk. That's why I think it is very important, because I think you're not going to know a lot of information about donor conception when you're right at the start of your journey. You're relying on people that are experts and have been through the process to kind of impart that knowledge, aren't you? It's a bit like going for fertility treatment. Most people wouldn't know anything about IVF before they've turned up at their clinic, I
have to really encourage people, regardless of what country you're in or where you live, to go for the counseling. I know that it's extra money, but it's extra money that's really helping you, at your present state, but also for your future and for your family. And that's invaluable. I personally love doing them. I think that they allow people an open, safe space to talk and just to listen. And so I really can't encourage it enough, but I also really would say, go to somebody who's qualified. Don't just, I think sometimes the doctors don't know what to do. They know that you should go, and they want you to go, and they ask you to, but then it's not really their realm to get into all the detail of, who the donor is and talking to your child and what are you going to do with your relatives and how are you going to tell them and what part is private, what part's secret, and what's your child going to think as they get older, and what if they want to meet their siblings, and do you want a relationship with the person? There's so much to consider. So, people like you, Hayley, are making it possible for people to recognize that. And, it's a real gift. It really is. And I think as people start to get your newsletter and see your website and the work that you're doing, it's invaluable for the community, and I've always said this to you privately, but I'm saying it to you publicly now because I
do that. Yeah, I mean, I do feel very passionate about it. And I think even if you're, you've already got children and they may be, young kids or, 5 or 6 or whatever, there's always things we can be doing to kind of make ourselves more prepared, for the next stage. And like I say, Laurie and I have spoken a lot. I've started doing some work for a parent hub called Paths to Parent Hub, where I'm primarily involved with the LGBTQ section, but we've been creating content on the hub, all to do with donor conception and supporting parents, with kids of all different ages, things you can do to kind of get confident with talking to your children, or if you're things that you're worried about. And because I think a lot of the time parents, like you say, they get all the information at the clinics, they get, they have this lovely baby, but then it's like, right, what do I do now? And I do see it where parents get, even my wife and I sort of had it a little bit where our children started to talk, and we were like, right, okay, we I think parents want in some instances to be open and honest with their kids, obviously, but they don't quite know how to do that. So like you say, I really enjoyed working on the hub, for the time that I have, because we're kind of dealing, with parents, face to face, and helping them and supporting them through that process.
I hope people, join that. I think it's so important, and the support groups are really important. People, I think, don't recognize how important that support is until they allow themselves. And a lot of people are private, they don't like to talk in front of other people. They don't want to go to a support group. But I can't encourage it enough that I'm such a believer in it, and you kind of see how people bond together, even if it's over Zoom. The bonding takes place, the knowledge takes place, the ability to talk takes place. And we can't leave out that emotional component. I'm not saying that because I'm a therapist. I'm saying that because that's where all our feelings go and all our emotions go when we're raising our family. So, and the LGBTQ community gets left out, I think, sometimes. So I'm really glad that you're doing a lot of work with them. We can't assume, and I think it's a horrible assumption, that because you went into a situation knowing that you're going to use a donor, that it makes it easy. It does not on any level. No. And I think that doesn't get said enough.
No, and thank you for saying that, because I do think there is some assumption sometimes, because, it is plan A, if you like, for a lot of LGBTQ individuals and couples to use a donor. But like you say, it's not always fully discussed, the emotions that might come up maybe for the non-carrying parent or the non-genetic parent, or, the concept of using a donor and how you pick a donor and what's important to you as a couple. And even down to think, like I did a great chat the other day where we were talking about family building priorities. So, actually thinking ahead a bit about your family building journey. So, for situations like my wife and I, like who was going to go first, in terms of like using, if we both wanted at some point to carry a child or use our eggs, about things like fertility preservation and all these kinds of topics, I think you don't really get the chance to talk about it really. And I think it's all really important conversations.
Well, it's so important, especially, with egg preservation. And, sometimes one person is older than the other, and you want to be sure that if the person who's older is not going to carry the child first, then those eggs are preserved so that they can. It's very important. I think also the legal ramifications are really important. That people forget when they're using a donor. You've got to get the legal information clear.
And certainly, like obviously in America or different parts of the world, there's different. I would always tell someone to go and speak to a lawyer or a solicitor we have in the UK, just to get some advice, because LGBTQ family building does come with complications if in terms of who's classed as the legal parent, for example, depending on the type of treatment you have. So it's a really good point, Laurie, and that's another layer to the process, isn't it? Where, sometimes doesn't always get acknowledged, I think, with, LGBTQ family building, sadly.
Yeah, no, there's so much there. And so I'm so glad that you're doing this in the hub, and I hope other people do it in other places, because we can't just assume. We can't make assumptions that things are easy for people just because we would think that they would be. It doesn't mean that they are. So yeah, I think it's great. So, Hayley, I don't know how much time we have left. I could talk to you all day.
I'm a bit mindful of time. But no, it's been great speaking to you, Laurie. Like I say, if anyone wants any further information, like I'm hoping my website, so it's All Things Donor Conception by Hayley King, which is obviously me, should be launching soon. So hopefully, I think by the time this goes live, it may well be available. So definitely come search for me there. And if you do like the sound of the Nugget series, which is, like I say, a downloadable resource for parents of donor conceived children, please do. And like you say, come say hello.
Yeah, Hayley's always open to that. And if anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me at lauriemetz.net. Thank you, Hayley.
Thank you for having me on, Laurie. It's lovely speaking to you.
Anytime.